Good morning. My name is Rabbi Chaim Balgley. I'm pleased to welcome you to a series of programs that we've entitled Freighted Legacies. This is now over a dozen programs that we've offered about cultural and historical issues, people, histories, cultural events that have spoken to us about the interaction between Jewish culture and Polish culture, both in its historical aspects, but also in its contemporary aspects. Today, we're going to be privileged to have as our guest Kathleen Balgley, who has just completed her book, Letters to My Father, Excavating a Jewish Identity in Poland and Belarus. I'm going to be introducing the panel and also introducing the author. But first, I want to introduce the executive director of Beit Polska, the progressive movement's executive director for the Jewish community in Poland, Dominika Zakaszewska, who is doubling not only as the executive director today, but as our engineer. She has greetings for us from Poland. And I'd like to remind people that this program is being delivered both in the English language and in the Polish language. And for that purpose, I want to call your attention to a technical feature. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll notice at the bottom a panel, and then at the panel there's something called interpretation. If you go to that place, you'll notice that you can choose to listen to this program either in English or in Polish, whichever language you're most comfortable with. The program will be available on video tape later on in either English or in Polish. This is part of our attempt to develop an audience in both languages. And just as a precursor, our next program will be, we hope, in English, Polish, and Ukrainian. And that's part of the report that Dominika will be bringing to you now. Dominika, please.
Good morning, good evening. It's my pleasure to welcome everybody in the name of Beit Polska. We are at the exciting moment of preparing for high holidays, where we will be joined by refugees from Ukraine. And in a few days, we'll also be happy to welcome in Poland Rabbi Barbara Brzesc, who will be officiating high holidays for us this year. I would also like to thank everybody who supports our activities and also our fund dedicated to supporting Ukrainian refugees in Poland. So for those of you who were with us during few past webinars, I'm also passing a great thank you from Teiva community in Lviv. And our support was very important for them also for this time of high holidays and making it possible for them to celebrate it the way that we are. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominika. So briefly, I'm going to introduce our panel. And of course, I refer you to our website that will have more details about our panel and our author. First, a word about Kathleen Balgley, who we are very happy to have here. She's just completed this enormous task of writing what I find one of the most fascinating books about people coming to Poland, confronting their past, as she says, excavating the past. When asked, she used the powerful phrase, why, her answer to the question, why did she go to rescue hope? And I find that to be a very powerful theme in all that she will share with us. Details about her life as an English teacher, which brought her to teach in Poland just before the fall of communism, and the biography of both her personal life and her connection to her family, specifically her father, and her profession as an English teacher come together in what are a number of very powerful vignettes that we will learn about. I also want to introduce our panelists. First, our first panelist, Louise Steinman, who's actually the veteran of the second of our freighted legacies. Her book that was at the center of our work, The Crooked Mirror, a memoir of Polish-Jewish reconciliation, which was also published in Polish and is available in Polish on Carta. Louise, as memoirist, is very important, and as a literary critic here in Los Angeles, and you can read about her on our website and on her website. My longtime friend, Galia Frank, who now resides in New Mexico, has just retired. Among her many important anthropological narratives is her book, Venus on Wheels. Galia is a master narrativist and has taught all of us about the importance of telling the story of how people live. And she's done that as an anthropologist, as a person who has worked with people in occupational therapy, and as a friend. And it has been a privilege to know her over some 50 years when we met as undergraduates. So it's a privilege to have her on the panel, and her biography is also on the website. And finally, a new friend who is Dominika Ferenc, Dr. Dominika Ferenc, a student of Kathleen Balgley when she was a graduate student studying in Wrocław, where she now teaches, but she's on a special Fulbright, and we are privileged to have her as a Californian for a year at the University of California at Irvine, and she specializes in Asian American literature, and the details of her biography are also available on the website. We are privileged and honored to have all of the panelists, and we are wanting to invite Kathleen to begin to frame our conversation with introducing just a passage to which the panelists will respond. And I have a sense, with all the power of expression and narrative concern, that we will not lack for any people to carry the conversation forward. If you have questions, we invite you to include them in the chat, and we will bring them to the fore. We're going to go a little longer than an hour, and we invite you, Kathy, to take up the cathedra and to share with us about your book, Letters to My Father.
Thanks first and foremost to Rabbi Chaim Balgley of Beit Polska, who tirelessly launches so many important projects, among them these webinars, Freighted Legacies. It's a perfect title for these stories. I'm honored to be among them. Thank you. And thanks to my accomplished panelists, Dominika Ferenc, Louise Steinman, and Galia Frank, for their expertise, time, and energy. Preservation of story with a capital S, this is at heart what my book is about. Something I regard as hardwired in human beings, our urge to preserve the stories of our families, of our neighborhood, of our nations, in an effort to find our own story. That effort so fundamental that the drive may even be unconscious. My book covers a wide expanse of time and space, invokes a number of themes. It wouldn't be possible to give voice to all of these today, but I'll name them here. The childhood relationship to a parent, the need to remove the veil of family secrets, the evolution of writing in my life from an early age, the heated question of Polish anti-Semitism historically and currently, the power of forgiveness, and finally, bashert, the Yiddish term variously translated, but which I use here as destiny. Dominika aptly named many of my experiences as quote unquote lucky accidents. And indeed, that's a fair perspective. But one of the tropes in the book is the sense that what I was able to uncover were not accidents, that I was somehow guided to readily discover needles in haystacks, that I was led by a force I couldn't name. So I'll now read the introduction from my book, and then at Chaim's suggestion, I have other excerpts to read. I'll stop so that the panelists have time to query and make comments about it. My father died on October 4, 2014. He was 102 years old. My three siblings, Michael, Janie, and Lisa, were at his bedside. I was not. I was in Europe. Somehow over time, my father and I had exchanged places. I was regularly in the old world from which he had come, he in the new. I realized it was a risk to be out of the country given his age, but so much of my life had been influenced by my father that I told myself I should go ahead with my plan to be in Europe anyway. Still, it was strange I shouldn't be there. The daughter who had spent so much of her life seeking out his story so that her own could also be told. And his story, veiled as it was, revealed a life began as a Jew in Poland in 1912, a shtetl existence of extreme poverty, hunger, and the absence of a father. The arduous journey he, his mother, and three siblings made to the US was in 1920. He mercifully escaped the Shoah, though many of his and my family did not. Not long after his arrival, he made a decision to turn his back on his Jewish identity. Later, he sought even to bury the place of his birth, responding with New York when asked. Some argue it's understandable, an American story of assimilation, a reasonable choice given the danger he had experienced and from which he wanted to protect himself and his family. But the abandonment of his true story, the erasure of his history, exacted a price, and that price became the heart of my conflict with my father. From as early as childhood, I was compelled to recoup that history. That drive felt fueled by forces unbidden, forces I could not even explain. I call it bashert, the Yiddish term variously translated, often as one's destined soulmate, I invoke as destiny. Even as a child, I was following in his footsteps with my enchantment with music. Even then, I was drawn to so-called otherness in people, everyday exoticisms in my local neighborhood, before I knew such was in him and in me. His silences were a mystery and troubling to me. His sudden emotions about certain events, like the murder of the Israeli athletes in Munich, when he told my mother in my presence, "If the world is like this, I don't want to live in it." And her horrified look that told me this was not the first time she had heard reactions like this from him. I felt his tottering, on the one side taking joy in his music and his science, yet on the other, not too far from giving up on the world. His dark view would flicker in and out of his enthusiasm for Chopin, Shakespeare, Einstein. I had gone to Poland to learn hard truths, but maybe especially because of his ambivalence toward life, also to rescue hope. He had not approved initially of my going, yet he was ultimately game, coming to visit me in Poland with my mother. His trip surprised him. I surprised him. I shook him at points out of his denial and pessimism, but it needs saying I also inherited those traits. The closest he and I touched on this shared ambivalence was when he smiled with understanding as I told him I had heard a saying, "There is nothing so whole as a broken Jewish heart." The candle child phenomena, the idea that one child in a family is designated and unbidden becomes the receptacle for history lost, the source of light for forgotten or repressed memory, fit my role in the family, the one member moved by forces uninvited to retrieve what had been lost, a role even hardwired. Such retrieval requires a search, a dredging up from the well of requisite forgetting, often attended by shame. I intuited my father's shame, his disdain for his past. Given the pathos of his and my family story and the stories of Jews worldwide, This seemed a crime to me. It was the drive to rescue what my father had left behind that sent me to Poland on a Fulbright for 2 years, just before the fall of the Iron Curtain, and then later to his birthplace, now in Belarus, to search the stories and fates of the Balgley family and archives there. Later, I found my relatives living in Israel and Germany and some in the United States, whom I had not known existed. I wanted to bring back the story to my father and to my siblings, to share a history of which we should be proud, a story at once powerful and fragile. Maybe my father and I had our closure before he died. It was the St. Patrick's Day. We were in California at a place called the Abbey Pub, where we each had a beer, he by now in a wheelchair, me by his side. He pondered silently for a moment and then remarked on the strange miracle that his long discarded Jewishness should come back to him in the form of his second daughter, when he said, "You are a lot braver than I ever was. An entirely new door opened for me." I'll stop there for now.
So we invite the panelists.
Well, it's a
Panelists?
beautiful story, and it's beautifully written. And as somebody who's been involved in studying biographical narratives and writing them, I'm very, very struck by two things. One, the idea about the hard truths and the desire to rescue hope. And I'm just thinking aloud as I'm talking to you that there's, as someone who's trained in anthropology, I think one of the strengths of your book that came through for me was the encounter that you have in Poland with Polish people and your Americanness, the fact that you're an American and you your approach to the hard truths and your effort to rescue hope has a particular cultural cast to it. You're an American, you can hope. And so I hope that you will develop this theme of hope and how history lost and forgotten and repressed can be, in your book, recast because you come from a perspective that is not as gelled or frozen, perhaps, as the past seems to people like your father and to some of the Poles that you met. So I know that you've presented it as a personal quest, but I also am very interested to hear about this, and maybe with the conversation with Dominika Ferenc on how hope is situated in terms of these differing histories and locations, generationally and culturally.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I always think that maybe I should have gone into anthropology instead of literature.
Welcome.
You know, well, yeah. Anyway, so your perspective is very interesting to me, and I appreciate that. I'm happy to go on and read another excerpt, or I'm happy to wait and hear more questions or observations.
I'll just make one comment, Kathy, about what you just read, kind of setting as you move forward with the next excerpt, which is, I was really struck by just what a strong force silence is in a family, what a strong force a child intuiting a sense of shame on a, I wrote a memoir also about my father's not speaking about the war and just how that, I think, and also I just want to say, and I think it's there in the first passage that you read, you're so good at at writing scenes, and it makes all these points that you're talking about really vividly alive, just appreciating that last scene in the pub with your father, you know, that you make it so visual. So just something I deeply enjoy about the book.
You're good, thank you. Right, and I know Louise's memoir about her father and his experience in the war, so, which is also very wonderful. So this is called Brooklyn, 1960. An uncharacteristic bath in the middle of the afternoon, and upstairs in the Catanzaro house, not in the usual basement set tub, a scratchy, fancy nylon ensemble, what we children derisively called a dressy dress. These marked something unexpected one day after my parents arrived. My cousin looked up at me descending the stairs from the bathroom and said in her best snotty voice, "Where do you think you're going?" I did not know, that was the thing. I only knew that I was to be clean and dressed up as on a holiday. From the familiar set tubs and dining room of the Catanzaro house that had now become like a second home to me, I only was told I was going to a place called Brooklyn. The trip from my mother's family on Long Island to Brooklyn, the home of my father's parents, might as well have been from one planet to another. Along the Belt Parkway, past the ships in New York Lower Harbor, past Fort Hamilton, glimpsing the bridge connecting Brooklyn to Staten Island and Manhattan's lower skyline, which boasted the famous aquarium in the Battery, away from Catanzaro's and O'Hara's, away from rooms of Catholic icons, Celtic crosses, and miniature shrines of serene Italian white china Madonnas, to a place entirely new and mysterious for me. You park in a crowded urban street, but one lined with remarkably large trees. You walk to the porch of the old Brooklyn brownstone apartment building. You do not walk in yet, but wait for the heavy door to seemingly unlock itself and find my dark, mustachioed grandfather, the super of the building, and I later learned its owner. Just behind him, but not for long, my grandmother followed, an imposing presence who clearly ruled the roost. Appearing much larger than my grandfather, she greeted us. With the sound of her voice, I had a memory of their visit to our Cranford, New Jersey home, and I blanched at the memory of what I had done with the pepperoni that day. I was also transfixed. She turned to my grandfather in quick Yiddish, directed him to open the door of their bottom floor apartment. We were in the building's hall. And as we entered, there before me was the heavy wooden furniture in a darkened room, ostensibly to keep cool from the bright afternoon. As my eyes adjusted, objects coming into focus, a burnished samovar, an old silvered menorah, small rooms, large furniture. They had lost another bigger home in the Depression, and these must have been remnants from its day. A profusion of newspapers, a table already set with steaming food, and the directive, "Come eat," delivered not once, but punctuating many times the duration of our stay, long after I thought mealtime had finished. Then my grandmother led the way to another room where sunlight fought through nearly closed louvered doors. The shuttered door opened, heat hitting us first, blinded by the sun, then eyes adjusting once again. There it lay, my grandmother's magnificent garden, lush in the middle of a cement enclosure, vegetables and flowers mixed together with no prejudice for one or the other. She grasped my mother's arm and in that deeply, differently cadenced English observed, "Don't we live on the smell of pepper plants? Feel we could eat the daffodil?" Many years later, I learned that she and her 4 children relied solely for survival almost entirely on the food she grew in a garden in Brest on the Polish-Russian border. Unlike the visits to my mother's family, which were typically protracted, unbounded by the clock, more like time spent at home where one did not have to hurry, since bags were unpacked and toothbrushes were in the medicine cabinet, here there was already in the air the sense of departure, of a set period of time now concluding. Formal, unfamiliar, odd. Like before with the pepperoni, but this time a new unexpected emotion roiled inside me. Enchantment. But in place of the pepperoni that had repulsed me as we prepared to depart, a silver dollar was pressed into my hand by my grandfather. I did not recognize it as money. It instead seemed akin to the golden wrapped chocolate covered cherries that sat in the silver bowl on the table in the darkened dining room. Like the D'Angelos and the Catanzaros, my grandparents were exotic, yes, but with the other families, I stood apart. I was an interested observer. But here, now, this was about me. That feeling was new, and it overtook me suddenly. In an uncanny way, during that visit, I remembered what I had never seen. I said nothing to my parents about that sensation, but I knew something had happened. I cannot actually explain it today, but it was a mysterious transformation. I was in an unknown place that I somehow knew. Although I knew I could not comprehend it, that experience began the discovery of my own exoticism, my own otherness. And because it was mine, unlike the D'Angelos and the Catanzaros, it hit me with remarkable force. I could not know then that I was beginning a journey that would take me to the villages of my grandparents' and father's birth. I could not know then that my father had early in his life abandoned his Jewishness, shed not only his religion, but also his Jewish identity, kept it hidden. And I was to hold it against him, my sense of his not owning himself, and thus my ignorance of my own identity, my inherited sense of a larger metaphoric displacement. Later in my life, I was to feel the full force of bashert, a word I could not have known as a child in my grandparents' Brooklyn apartment, and in a dramatic way I could not have predicted then.
Mm.
Again, I'm going to invite the panelists. They'd like to jump in, Dominika. And I will note that we have an extra Kathleen Balgley on our screen. His name is actually John, husband of Kathy. And welcome, John. You're not quite a panelist, but welcome.
John, you're on here. You just said you're on here. That's what he just said. Welcome to you.
Oh, right here.
I don't see him though.
Okay.
So I've been invited to jump
Oh,
in,
look at-
and I will. I'm struck once again when I hear you read, Kathy, that I remember now why you were such an inspiring and such a passionate teacher when you came to Poland, and how you also taught us as not just as a literature teacher, but as a writing teacher, to pay attention to words and word combinations and style. That it's just what is very personal to you is also very beautiful, I think, to everyone in the audience. And I remember you in two roles when you came to Poland, when I met you in 1988, as a passionate teacher, extremely seductive as a teacher, and also as someone very attentive to her students. That would be the one side of you I remember. And the other side of you was that of a guilty conscience, as someone who would put sticks in the spokes of our wheels constantly, kind of prodding us to reflect on the past that we didn't really know much about. And I want you to talk about, at some point, about the attitudes that you encountered in Poland that compelled you to play that second role, the role that people didn't necessarily love you for, and how it felt to play that role, that very difficult role of being the spoilsport, that someone who would put people out of their comfort zone. I don't know if you're planning to read a passage about that, but I really look forward to it. Thank you.
Kathy, can I second that? It's so, first of all, it's very moving to hear from someone who was one of your former students. I didn't.
How lucky am I? Yeah.
Yeah, it's really great because I was also very moved and interested in the interactions. To me, it's one of the, it's really a charged part of the book. And as Gilly was talking about, you're being an American, and from my own experience in Poland, knowing that it's really hard to understand the depths of the silence in Poland around the issue of the Jewish past, how taboo it was, and in a way your own naivete at the time of like why this caused such a why people would give you such abrupt answers or turn away from you is very fascinating and very telling and very beautifully told.
Okay, thank you. And too, know that Dominica is the best student I ever had across all countries and all time. And she also got her PhD at UCLA and then has been a wonderful professor in Wrocław, where she was my student, and is now on a Fulbright in UC Irvine. So I love how these things, and is here today, which I am so grateful for. It's interesting we're talking about this because the two passages that I had to decide on address this. One is in the classroom, which happened to be, by then I'd invited students to my flat because it was warmer there than in the classroom. But the other is at a faculty party, with a dinner party with Polish faculty and visiting American faculty. And that's what I'd like to read next, because it speaks exactly to what Dominica said and also what Louise has underscored. The flowers were more ostentatious than I would have liked, but at that hour, they were the only ones available. Marzena furrowed her brow when she greeted me at the door and said, "Kate, you mustn't feel like you have to bring flowers every time we meet." I was a little embarrassed, but it was understandable she'd say this, and nice of her too. Another American couple whom I had met before at our orientation in Krakow were there, as well as other Polish faculty. Fyodor Kański was Polish-American and not well liked by the other Fulbrighters when we were in Krakow. His manner was arrogant generally, and being Polish-American felt he knew much more about the country than any of us. That night, he was expounding on the American literature courses he was teaching, and when he finished, he moved on to demonstrate his knowledge of Polish writers. As he indicated the names of well-known Polish writers, I mildly observed, "And so many of them are Jewish Polish writers." A silence descended on the gathering. People stole glances at one another. In this sophisticated group of academics, it seemed reasonable that there ensue an informed discussion of the implications of this fact. But no. As an American academic accustomed to open discussion of controversial topics, it must be said that Kański nodded affirmatively, but he did not take up what he knew was at the heart of my observation. I could not let the silence go unremarked, so I plunged ahead. It strikes me as ironic that we Americans teach the history of American prejudice in our ethnic American literature classes to our Polish students, but we do not address the history of ethnic prejudice in their own country. I know that my family experienced pogroms before the war here in Poland. Family lore has it that a relative of mine, a physician, was killed by his Polish neighbors. Little did I know at that time that a book like Neighbors by Jan Gross, which documented the massacre of Jedwabne Jews by their Polish neighbors, would appear 11 years later, January 28, 2000. Up to that time, I had not shared with the group that my father was Jewish and born in Poland. Indeed, Marzena had taken me for a Roman Catholic when we had visited her church together. Maybe it was slightly unfair of me to shock her in this way, to reveal what had not been clarified privately earlier. But somehow that night, I cared less about that sort of fairness. I thought of the Poles I had argued with in California, their adamant denials of Polish anti-Semitism, the refusal to compromise even a little on the subject. After all, a much larger unfairness was up for grabs at that moment. I felt the heat rise to my face. Marzena turned to me and said, and I can never forget her exact words, "They must have had a good reason for it." As if a murder can ever have a good reason for it, as if to wipe clean any implication of racially motivated hatred, in spite of what she had to know about the pogroms in her country. I looked around the room where people were trying to look any place but at her or at me. And a vision of other polite, comfortable dining rooms throughout history drifted across my mind, where other polite, intelligent, and supposedly civilized people socialized and tolerated the anti-Semitism that led to the final solution. In those parlors and dining rooms, not enough people, whether agreed or not, would have said an opposing word. Better to remain silent, not to cause a problem at a social gathering. Coincidentally, the television had been on with the sound turned off all this time. At that moment, the face of Jerzy Urban, Poland's communist Jewish press secretary, appeared, a man much hated by anti-communist Poles, and with arguably good reasons. He had published his views on the soon-to-be murdered activist priest Jerzy Pohusko, calling him an anti-communist Savonarola. Urban had accused the United States of knowing in advance about the installation of the 1981 martial law and betraying solidarity, and he regularly proclaimed his atheism. The group glanced over at the television. Marjana gestured at Urban's image on the screen as if to say, well, there you have it. This is why Poles don't trust Jews. She raised her eyebrows and looked at me in the circle of her guests and shrugged. True, she did not say those words, and I was no fan of Urban's. But what shocked was the ready ease with which we could slip from a story about Poles murdering a Jewish neighbor to the dislike of a Jewish communist government official. Was Marjana's meaningful shrug on the heels of her comment, they must have had a good reason for it, a quid pro quo, a justification? It seemed so. I suddenly felt physically ill. The room, like all rooms in Polish homes, was overheated. I had had some wine, and as I looked at people who said nothing, I wanted to be out of that company as soon as possible. I was not prepared to be rude, to make a scene. In fact, I felt that the issue itself and my feelings about it behooved me to act with grace, so not to invite more shrugs in my absence about the overreacting Jewess. I allowed the subject to change. I reasoned I had said enough to distinguish me from the silent ones in the imaginary picture of other dining rooms. Maybe that was an excuse to myself, but I did not have the heart or the stomach to go further with it, so I waited until my departure might not be associated with the exchange and took my leave. Marjana had called a radio taxi for me, the only way one could get a cab that late at night in the suburb. She walked me to the door, thanking me again for the roses. I returned the thanks for the dinner. But once I got into the freezing night air, I felt even sicker, and I realized that the heat in the house and the wine were not the reasons I was ill. The cab got me home to my building, which seemed exceptionally ugly now, isolated and even menacing. Sweating in the cold, I paid the driver and went up the 14 flights of stairs to my flat. Without taking off my coat or turning on lights, I fell face up on my pull-out bed in the dark. What I remember most was the sound of the wind howling outside the building. Suddenly, everything in my flat's block seemed alien, foreign in a frightening way. I made it to the bathroom and vomited, and then stumbled back to the bed, still in my coat and scarf. I lay there for hours, staring straight up into the dark. Why had I come to this place? Who had been hunted and murdered in the woods just adjacent to my apartment? How immodest, arrogant of me to have come here at all in search of answers, to the very killing fields of my family and my people. An ignorant little girl from California who thought she could take on such questions, and alone? Was this a self-imposed exile under this filthy sky, a form of penance, I wondered? And for what? My father's passing? My own? And more. Had I insulted the memory of the murdered ones by coming here at all? And on the other side, who was I to condemn the silent ones tonight, especially the Poles? What did I know of their experience, privileged visitor that I was? Still, it was the easy slippage of the mention of a racially motivated murder to the dislike of a politician. That was what sickened. Hannah Arendt's phrase came to me, the banality of evil. Yes, that explained why I was nauseous. But it was Sunday night, and tomorrow I needed to be up early and ready to go to the Institute to teach the American experience in the morning.
So, if I may, there are people who've already read the book, and they would love to engage with what you raise in the book. And I think we have a unique experience ahead of us if we can get a conversation going between Kathy and Dominika. Dominika, you can bring a perspective as a Polish person, citizen, someone from Poland in the time that Kathy was there. And for those who haven't read the book, I'm sure that you're gaining a lot of readers already. But you raise so many questions, you know, that and you said what were the answers that you were looking for, and how could you have asked the questions from your position as a naive California girl? And I think that the large question that your story raises, and stories by other narrators, I was thinking last night of Stefan Dubner's book, Turbulent Past, and the big question is, so what is gained? What is gained? Your book tells us lots of incidents, and you do that so beautifully. And it's clear that you come to you a very, very nuanced and rounded set of memories. But for the person who's coming from outside, what can be gained from what did you learn, and what do we learn from this? So I'd like to pitch this question actually first to Dominika Ferenc. I'd love to get her perspective as someone who knows you, and as someone who's Polish and wrestling, I'm sure, with many of the same questions.
I feel out of place answering this question. What's been gained for me is that I've had the privilege of meeting Kathy on many occasions since 1998, and I've followed the writing of this story. I've met her when she came. I met her when she came to Poland to find her family graves, to go to Belarus and wrest knowledge about her family from Belarusian archives. And one of the things that happened to me is that I began to poke around my family history as well. And when we first met, I didn't know I was half Jewish, but it seemed like a theme that she planted in many people's minds about the way histories, the Polish-Jewish histories intersected. So it made me go out on a much smaller and less ambitious quest. And I think this has happened to many Poles who have no Jewish ancestry, who were forced by Kathy to look closer at the things that they had heard whispered. I'm really moved by the fact that she really was a pioneer, planting thoughts in people's minds. Today, there is a library of books on Polish-Jewish history. So much has been written in the last 3 decades, but she really was striking it out on her own and paying a very high cost for it, as we heard in the previous excerpt, right, that she read, that this was not a journey undertaken lightly to prod people's consciences. Yeah, thank you. That's all I wanted to say.
Okay, thank you.
Very interesting. Thank you.
There's
Kathy,
another
do you want-
excerpt. There's another excerpt I was gonna, it was a choice between this one with, adult faculty, and then one where Dominika was actually present, where I urged my students to, after
Well,
4 months.
could I push you just a little bit to
Sure.
to answer the question about, what now at this remove, years later, what is there to be learned? Chaim and I attended a lecture or a workshop with Barbara Kirschen-Black Gimlet, who is the director of the Poland Museum. And there was a man in the audience, very typical in many ways, a Polish Jew, former Polish Jew, who said, the Poles imbibe this with their mother's milk. They imbibe the anti-Semitism with their mother's milk. It's hopeless. Forget about changing things, changing attitudes, changing. And I see Dominika shaking her head. Let's go to that. I'd like to hear about that.
Okay, good. Thank you for insisting on that question, because you're right to ask it. Look, when I went, as Dominika has already said, in 87, this was not a topic that was openly discussed. And I got lots of red faces and embarrassed students and adults who ducked away from looking at it. I don't know if they resented me. I mean, Dominika, you're sort of saying that maybe they did, that I pushed too hard. I didn't really get that. I got, in fact, the other excerpt I thought about sharing was the one where a student gets so angry that he slams out of my flat because I proposed the idea of Polish anti-Semitism, and he's not going to hear any of it. But he came around many years later. I got to meet him again. Anyway, so it was not talked about at all, right? And so I felt that I needed to bring it forth as much as I could, but with modesty, with, you know, especially with young people who weren't even alive during that time, you know, so as not to alienate, but to get them to open up and to think about it. And not so much about whether or not they had Jewish blood or not, but just the history of Poland's non-acknowledgement of these crimes. And, you know, I remember at one point saying, look, the history of Poland is courageous enough that you needn't apologize for it. But we've been talking about my country, the United States, for 4 months and looking at all the atrocities that we committed. You must acknowledge if you're going to really honor your country's past. I mean, that's why it's so ironic now that we have this critical race theory going on where the right wing in this country is trying to prevent upsetting students by, you know, educating them in that very, very terrible American history. So I was studying a version of that to my Polish students. Now, going forward in time, what I saw was amazing, a growth, and the book speaks to that, a growth of interest in the history of Polish Jews and what had happened in Poland, and all the wonderful books that have come out and studies that have come out, including the museum that you speak of. You know, in my day, I used to just go to the plots of the Warsaw Ghetto. Now, when you go there, as you know, is the wonderful Poland Museum, the history of Polish Jews. So it's been literally an explosion. And as Dominika has already said, there are libraries full of books about this topic now, but there weren't then. So I was able to experience this growth and then come back to Poland and look at it. I came back and I saw Kazimierz, the former Jewish quarter in Krakow, kind of turned into a little bit of a Disneyland. I was happy to see that there was this acknowledgement of its Jewish past, but it was a little bit off-putting and even upsetting to see, you know, these signs with the former Jewish shopholders' names emblazoned on these awnings, as if, and people walking around and tasting Jewish food and what have you, a little bit like us with our Native Americans, you know.
Kathy,
They're gone now, but we're going to visit them. But what was gained for me was the opportunity to observe firsthand this non-acknowledgement and this anti-Semitism, and also the heroism of Poles and of the students who were willing to take on the question. And I get to that in the book too. And then finally for me, to bring it all home to my family, to say, not only should my father not disdain his origins, should have been proud of him. And I think
Kathy,
maybe
I have a question, a follow-up question. I don't mean to bogart the conversation, but I mean, I want to ask this because it concerns me, which is, you know, is it possible that our American perspective is that we think that it's possible to have a reconciliation. We think that it's possible to share a perspective, and that can happen not only on the individual to individual level, but it could happen culturally or it could happen internationally. And I'm thinking about the section in your book where you have a conversation about feminism with Polish women. And in one of the conversations, you're challenged by someone who says, you know, this kind of feminism that not demonizes men, but at least contrasts the interests of women with those of men, that we can't afford, the Polish woman says, to have that kind of feminism. That kind of feminism is a luxury for us. And that and other conversations made you at least question, your assumptions. And I'm wondering about this question about being American and this question of hope. And is it possible that we want a Hollywood ending to these questions, and that we want to have a warm embrace and we feel good that we made that connection? And I see you shaking your head, so come at me.
Yeah, no, I'm shaking my head, yes, and no, and yeah, here's excellent. You took us right to where I think we need to be, which is the present. I talked about how there was this wonderful growth after I left of interest in Polish Jewish history by Poles. But with the election of the Law and Justice Party, I left just as the roundtable talks were happening, and I had my students write about, it was the first open election, free election. Who are they going to vote for? And I've kept those essays. Now we've had a reversal. Now I guess the new scapegoat is the gay community, which is so distressing to me. What's happened in Poland is now, to me, heartbreaking. So no, there is no Hollywood ending. And there wouldn't have been even if Law and Justice hadn't come into power. This is such a complex issue that you couldn't hope to excise anti-Semitic feelings like this mother's milk. Poles take it in with this mother's milk. But I did feel, at least while I was teaching there, that I couldn't just sit back and assume that all Poles were anti-Semitic, that was its own kind of prejudice. And I will tell you that I gave many talks on my return to Jewish audiences and Polish audiences, and I got people really riled up, especially the Jewish audiences. They didn't want to hear anything good. They called it live flesh, like an Almodovar film. They didn't want to hear anything good about Poland or Poles. And I said, well, I'm sorry, I'm reporting to you my experience, and this is what I have to tell you.
Kathy, I so much echo that, having had that experience of speaking to Jewish audiences, but I wanted to introduce into this fascinating discussion this quote by Zygmunt Bauman. He says, he was talking about Jedwabny and the kind of discussion over that. He says, the issue is not whether Poles should feel ashamed or whether they should feel proud of themselves. The choice is not between shame and pride. The choice is between the pride of morally purifying shame and the shame of morally devastating pride. And since you were there discussing, American literature and the legacy of slavery, and some of your students were writing about that. I find that so fascinating, and that they were doing their theses on Zora Neale Hurston. So we also are struggling as a nation with, nations don't do shame very well. And pride is also this lever, that governments use to, propel nationalism. And so I think you were really playing with that dynamic of like, how do we look honestly at our past, both as Americans, and but they had been under like an iron cloud of like, you may not talk about this.
Yeah.
We see how hard it is for us even now to talk about what happened in this country. I have so much more empathy for their silence and their fear of speaking about these things.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, Louise, because I remember in your webinar that in your book you quote Bauman's, it's not a choice between shame or pride. That's spot on. That says it all. Dominika, you were.
Yeah, please.
I just wanted to jump in on the tail end of Louise's question and ask you perhaps to say a little bit more about the saga of your father's citizenship. How do you explain the fact that, even as a trained engineer, as a Juilliard graduate, as a father of many children, he was still technically an undocumented person in the United States, having had an American father? Can you explain that?
Just incredible, because, as those who've read the book and know the story, my grandfather preceded my grandmother and the 4 children by 7 years they were apart. That was not unusual. That happened. He left in 1913, literally short of a year after my father was born. And they did not hear from him or see him. And then one day, a horseback riding gentleman showed up with passage on the La Lorraine to depart for all of them. And so they went. But know this, my grandfather had established his citizenship and had started a business on Delancey Street. I know, I visited it. It was a hardware store. And then it became a synagogue for a while, interestingly. So if my grandfather Israel had his citizenship, then automatically his children and his wife would have derivative citizenship. So I always asked my father about this. He said, well, I think that my father didn't keep the papers or I couldn't prove it. And what was so telling to me is I never knew any of this until, you know, I'd been in Poland. My father, in the book, I replicate, you know, the paperwork that he had gone through. And it wasn't until after I was born, the third child, so that was 52, that he got proof of his American citizenship. And he had to jump through so many hoops because he did not have proof of the derivative citizenship. So that in itself is a tale, and it's a tale for immigrants now in this country, to this country. Yeah, it took a long time. You figure he arrived in 1920 and he got proof in 1953. There you go. Chaim, do you think I should read another excerpt or should I be quiet?
I actually want to see if we can double back to a part of this question, because I note that recently the March of the Living in Israel has stopped all visits to Poland, which is as a result of the request by the Polish government that they have their guide take over the guiding of Israeli high school students, and the Israeli March of the Living groups were stopped. And I actually thought that this was a golden opportunity, that in contrast, the American March of the Living, and by the way, I'm not a fan of either one of the March of the Living approaches, neither the Israel one or the American one. But in this moment, the idea that well-trained Israeli high school students would be debating a well-trained Polish guide about the issues of Polish history for the 3-4 days that they were together might actually produce some interesting conversations rather than what I would call silence. And I think it goes to this question of everybody holding on to their narrative and not engaging at all. As someone who's been involved in these issues, I can't tell you the number of times on our Facebook or in our requests for support, the response to, will you support Jewish life in Poland, or will you support the spread of knowledge about Jewish life in Poland, is the Poles did this to my grandfather, or did that to my uncle. In other words, a non sequitur, instead of seeking information. I hadn't wanted to participate, but I think that this desire to sort of walk away from the conversation is something that your book demands that we re-engage at sometimes a very, very high cost, which you paid not only in your personal appearances when you spoke. And Louise, every time I spoke to you, you also talked about how it was difficult to come to a Jewish audience and be told, you know, what are you doing this for? So it is a difficult road that you've chosen, and I suspect it is not easy for Poles to do the same thing, talking about the Polish past. Just your response.
That's very helpful, Chaim. And of course, you talk about what we've absorbed, and of course, what you absorb, as the director of Beit Polska and taking Jewish people to Poland, Jewish Americans to Poland. This always comes up. I have been told we cannot discuss this at all. And I think we have to insist on it.
Kathy, I'm really and thank you for that, Chaim. But I'm really I'm so amazed at your drive all the way through this project, to do it. I remember, and I wonder if you had any of these feelings when I first thought about doing this kind of a project. I remember Lawrence Weschler, who had been the New Yorker correspondent, I believe, during the Solidarity days. He would say, like, "Oh my God, don't get into that. That's a subject you really don't want to, you really don't want to." And I had a little bit of that feeling all along of like, I'm not writing a book about Poles and Jews. I'm not writing, like, why would someone go into that? Like, this is like the most fraught, but you seem to have such a determination and a drive and all through the book. With what you went through, I don't know, maybe your undauntedness, I'm overstating it, but you were very determined to do this, and I think it's really remarkable.
Well, I was determined, but I also gained so much from it. And this speaks a little bit to Galia's question, like, so what comes from this? I got an education from my students too, and from the Poles I met there. And it's important to say that I had visited Poland with John, my now husband, who had been there in '81 during martial law exhibiting his paintings. He's Polish American, but doesn't feel any particular connection to Poland as, part of his past. He's not one of those people who feels that kind of connection. So I had been there in '84 with him. And in the book, I say, I met the friends he had made in '81, and they were all wonderful people. And I would bring up this question about the history of Polish Jews. And they, as I say in the book, I said their foreheads would furrow with sympathy and empathy, but they didn't know that much about it and hadn't really paid attention. They were so, like you called it, the Iron Dome. They were so, at that time, under pressure, the way they were living, that really the idea of looking at other victims, somebody wrote, and I quote it in my book, victims don't like to be accused of being victimizers. So there was this pushback, we're not going to look at that. So, but I want to come back to the wonderful experiences that I had there and why I continued to go back and why I then had to get a visa many years later to travel to Belarus to find my father's metrics, as they call it, and to learn more about my family who had been annihilated there. And in fact, if you'll allow me to end on kind of a high note, a positive note, this last excerpt gets at what I got out of it. So it speaks to Galia, it speaks to Louise, and it underscores, I think, some of what Dominika was getting at about being in the classroom. It's called Snow Falling on Radiators, with apologies to David Guterson. Although the interior staircase of the Institute was a grand swirl of lush cream marble wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass with room to spare, the state of the halls and classrooms of the building boggled the Western mind. Rusted pipes littered a fine centuries-old black and white parquet floor. Begun but abandoned repairs loomed like sculptures in corners beneath high-curved, meticulously crafted moldings on walls and ceilings, paint peeling, huge gashes in plaster. And dimness, light mostly through windows, many cracked or broken, and cold. Marble and parquet and high ceilings do not afford much warmth to begin with, and there was no heat. We were well into the semester, and it was winter by the time I took my familiar route down the marble staircase. The steps so broad, I found that I always stayed on one side and held onto the heavy wooden banister like a rudder. The hall below was dark as usual, but the classroom for the masters in American literature, which I taught, sat at the end of the hallway with one of its walls featuring huge windows facing the morning sun. So unlike the halls, our room was bright. The contrast between the building's dispiriting surroundings and the faces of my students never ceased to strike me. There we were confronted at every turn with the signs of a decaying society, yet the vitality in those students lit the room like nothing else could. When I turned the corner of the hall and walked into the room, that vitality was palpable. They were alive. They were ready for all exigencies, intellectual and otherwise. The world they operated in made them savvy and mature in ways my graduate students in California could not be. Although most of those students had not traveled out of their own country, they were worldly and prematurely wise. Their sense of the irony of their situation in communist Poland gave them a sophisticated sense of humor and a heightened perception which they profitably brought to bear in their analyses of ethnic American literature, our subject. But no amount of vitality could warm the freezing room. We all kept on our coats for much of the 4-hour seminar, or we stripped down to our layered sweaters, all of us with wool scarves around our necks. We always got down to business quickly, but over the week, students had smilingly reminded me that we should break at least once during the 4 hours. They needed to have a cigarette. I had to laugh at my own obtuseness. In my enthusiasm for their work, I often lost track of the hours going by. One particular day, the light was gray, and a fine snow was falling steadily outside the seminar room windows. We took the break and relaxed for a few minutes. A pleasant quietness filled the room as we all turned our gaze to the falling snow outside. All at once, the room erupted into laughter. Outside the windows, on the frozen ground, lay a stack of radiators torn from the classrooms, gathering layers of the quickly falling snow. That darkly humorous picture of discarded radiators ripped from their moorings, once inside, now gathering snow outside, while we shivered inside without heat, distilled in one image all of Polish life under communism, everything in a constant state of remont, ubiquitous signs indicating renovation, buildings growing old before they were finished. All the wrong-headedness of life, they are represented by these mistaken starts, uncompleted beginnings, unwisely chosen sequence of work, running out of materials, a metaphor for the entire broken system, an external manifestation of the existential plight of my Polish students. That they could laugh at the image was the heart of their charm. And then finally, this is short, a perfect day for bananas, with apologies to J.D. Salinger, who wrote, of course, A Perfect Day for Banana Fish. I had noticed during those breaks in the seminar, which students at last had trained me to remember, that students brought sweet pastries typically covered in rather toxic-looking cream or icing. During my years of teaching at home, I often offered some food to students during class to make them feel considered and to establish community among us. One morning, as I walked along the Oder from the flat at Platz Grunwaldzki to the Institute, I wondered what I might take to those students. What would be welcomed? What would be culturally appropriate? The ages-old Targovo Market Hall was close by, and I was early enough before class to stop in. The hall was huge and filled with all variety of items, from household wares like pots and pans to a display of produce. I quickly scanned the offerings and felt that nothing would suffice when I happened to notice a wooden box filled with a modest number of bunches of bananas. My first reaction, judging from the sugary pastries they had brought, was that bananas might be the wrong choice. Class began as usual with students prepared, game, and ready to work. I remembered that time to break after an hour or so, and students had begun to take out their smokes when I recalled the bananas in my briefcase. I had forgotten all about them in the day's busy agenda for the seminar. Again, I wondered if such an offering would be ridiculous or even insulting. I presented the fruit with an apology saying, "I'm not sure if you will like what I brought us, but here you are." The students looked surprised, and then faint smiles appeared on their faces. I distributed a banana to each student as they sat at their desks and took one for myself as I relaxed back at my own desk. I was thinking that, as usual, their always courteous behavior was at work here. They accepted the fruit, but would not have told me that this was a silly gift. As we each peeled our banana, I casually asked, do you even like bananas? At that moment, all the students looked at me, and one of them said, "We believe we do, Kate, but we haven't tasted one in so long we can't remember." I understood in an instant what I should have realized before. The price of bananas made them an unaffordable luxury for most people in Poland. They were a gourmet treat. I nodded and indicated how once again I learned from them. Then the 13 of us sat quietly gazing out the windows at the snow and slowly savoring our bananas until break was over. So that kept me going all the time. And that's, there was great joy all the time with my students. And Dominika was one of them who helped me so much. I needed to find places to Xerox things, and I didn't know where to go. And actually, you weren't supposed to do that. And so I was taken to literally underground. It was underground and also underground in the way we understand it, to make photocopies for things I wanted to share with students. So that balanced the difficult times. And I felt just so fortunate that I had that experience to live there for 2 years. In fact, I applied for a second year after I'd been there the first year, and then to go back continually many years following and currently. I promise I'm not reading any more excerpts.
Beautiful.
Kathy, I want to thank you so much. I want to thank our panelists, Louise, Dominika, Galia. There are many questions that were asked that we did not answer. I did propose to Kathy that maybe in 6 months, after some people have had a chance to read, there will be an opportunity to return to this book as people have had a chance to absorb and read it. I do want everyone to see a copy of the cover and to know that it's available on Amazon, and invite you to get a copy to read it. There are some excerpts if you need a little more of an appetizer, and there's a very nice excerpt that has been translated into Polish by Karta. Some wonderful, powerful publishers in Poland. Again, thank you to Kathy for the book for this time. Kathy has been operating under the difficulty of some health issues this morning, so we wish her a complete refuah shlema, complete recovery. Thank you to Dominika, who was challenged with some technical things. Louise and Galia, thank you for your wisdom and participation. I want to make mention of the fact that we will convene as Freighted Legacies on October 23rd in a program that we've entitled In the Matter of Ukraine. I'm proud to share with you that the two professors that we've invited are Professor Matthew Light of the University of Toronto, who will share not only his professional expertise, he's involved in issues around questions of public and citizen security in post-Soviet region, contemporary issues in the post-Soviet region. And a colleague of his, also a Canadian, at McGill University, Aaron Ehrlich, public opinion research in Ukraine. There will be tomorrow essays that will be opportunities for you to read. This is going to be an unusual opportunity for us to focus on Ukraine and the contemporary issues, which are of concern to all of us, not only as part of our concern for what is going on in the region, but in Poland in particular. We've been involved in a series of programs that deal specifically with child welfare, the mothers and children that have come as refugees to Poland, in a program that we've entitled the Janusz Korczak Children's Welfare Activities. And we've been involved with other activities, but this has been the center of our activity. We hope that you'll tune in October 23rd and participate. Finally, I want to wish everyone a happy, healthy new year coming up. And again, to thank the author, Kathleen Balgley, and all of our panelists. A special greeting to Dominika Zakraszewska and the Polish Jewish community. Thank you for your participation, all of you. Shana Tova, may you have a good and sweet coming year.